The Lanterns of Solmare ******. The sea around Solmare never slept. Even in the stillest hours before dawn, it murmured in its deep, patient tongue, brushing against the cliffs like a hand tracing old scars. The town itself, perched above the restless waters, had been built from pale stone that shimmered faintly in moonlight, as though it remembered the ocean even when it couldn't be seen. For generations, the people of Solmare had lived by the rhythm of the tides, their lives shaped by a custom older than memory, the lantern procession. Every year, on the eve when the twin moons crossed paths, every household lit a single lantern and set it adrift on the tide. Each flame carried a promise, some whispered prayers for love returned, others for forgiveness never asked aloud. The lanterns drifted toward the horizon, 100 soft lights swaying like stars fallen into the sea. By dawn, they were gone. Some said they sank, others that they were taken. Orion had never believed in the tales. He was the son of a fisherman who spoke little and believed less, raised on calloused hands and the taste of salt. To him, the procession was a story for children and the weary a ritual of longing dressed in beauty. Yet as he stood that night on the edge of the cliffs, lantern in hand, the light trembling in the sea breeze, he felt something stirring beneath his ribs, a flicker of unease, or perhaps of memory. His mother's voice returned to him then, soft and distant, like waves over stones. When you send your lantern, don't look away. The sea always remembers who turns their eyes first. She had said that to him years ago, before the tide had taken her boat and never brought it back. The villagers had spoken of a sudden storm, but Orion had never seen the sky darken that day. Only the water had changed, rising, whispering, as though it had called her by name. Now, as he lowered his lantern onto the surface, the flame trembled once and steadied. The glow spread across the water like spilled amber, mingling with hundreds of others drifting slowly away. Yet one light, one faint, flickering glow farther out, moved against the current. It glided toward the cliffs, deliberate, silent. Orion frowned. That wasn't possible. The lanterns always drifted eastward, carried by the tide. But this one came west, a pale shimmer cutting through the waves, as if drawn by unseen strings. The villagers beside him were still singing the old hymns, their voices rising and falling with the surf, but Orion couldn't hear the words anymore. He leaned forward, eyes fixed on that wandering light. When it reached the rocks below, it stopped. Its flame grew brighter, then flared white, almost blinding. The song faltered. The air grew thick and heavy, filled with the scent of brine and something else, something sweet, like lilac in summer rain. And from the heart of that brightness, a voice spoke, not aloud, but through the air itself, rippling through the silence like wind through glass. Why did you call me? Orion stumbled back, his breath catching. No one else seemed to hear it. The villagers were still watching their own lanterns, murmuring prayers to the tide. Yet the voice pressed against his thoughts again, soft and insistent. You turned your eyes away once. Do you remember? The wind rose suddenly, scattering the nearest lanterns. Their flames wavered but did not die. Orion took a step closer to the edge, his pulse echoing in his throat. Beneath him, the sea glimmered, each wave a mirror of shifting light. He saw shapes moving beneath it, faint silhouettes drifting in slow spirals. For a moment, he thought they were fish, but they moved too gracefully, too humanly. He blinked, and they were gone. By morning, the town was whispering. Some said a light had broken from the procession, burning brighter than any they had seen before. Others claimed the tide had brought something ashore, a piece of old wood, carved with runes long forgotten. But Orion said nothing. He couldn't explain the voice that lingered behind his thoughts, nor the dream that had followed him into sleep of a vast chamber beneath the sea, filled with hanging lanterns that burned without flame. The next day, he found the carving on the beach himself. It lay half buried in the sand, smooth as bone, warm to the touch though the air was cold. The symbols carved into it shimmered faintly when he tilted it toward the sun. They weren't words, not as he knew them, but they pulsed like a heartbeat. He slipped it into his pocket before anyone else could see. For the next few nights, he could not sleep. The sound of waves grew louder in his dreams, their rhythm aligning with his own breath. Sometimes he heard faint music, like strings played underwater. Sometimes he saw his mother standing just beneath the surface, lantern in hand, her eyes calm and knowing. She never spoke, she only beckoned him closer. Orion began to walk the shore after dark. He told himself it was to think, to breathe the night air, but deep down, he knew he was searching. The sea had become different, alive in ways he could not name. Even the fishermen whispered that the tides had changed course, that the moon's pull had grown strange. And one evening, when the sky turned violet and the horizon burned gold, Orion saw the light again, the same lantern if it was a lantern moving against the tide, its glow steady and slow. Without thinking, he followed it, down the narrow path that wound along the cliffs, across the slick stones where the waves hissed and curled. The light danced just ahead, never near, never far. When he reached the edge where the tide met the cave mouth, it paused, hovering above the water like a patient star. Then it slipped into the dark. The cave was one the children of Solmare were warned never to enter. They called it the Hollow of Tides, a place where the sea forgot its way and circled upon itself. But Orion no longer felt fear. He stepped into the darkness, the carving in his pocket glowing faintly in response to the light ahead. The air grew cooler, damp with the scent of salt and age. He followed the glow through twisting stone, his footsteps echoing softly. The deeper he went, the more he felt a rhythm beneath his skin, like the sea breathing around him. When he emerged into the wide chamber beyond, he stopped. The walls shimmered with streams of water that flowed upward instead of down. Hundreds of lanterns hung in the air, drifting like motes of fire suspended by invisible threads. Some were whole, their flames steady. Others flickered, dimming to embers. At the center stood a single figure cloaked in sea glass and silver light. Her face was hidden, but her voice was the same that had spoken to him. "You have returned." Arian's throat went dry. "Returned? I've never been here." The figure tilted her head, and for a heartbeat, the air trembled as if amused. "All who belong to the tide return, sooner or later. You sent your light once, and we answered." He took a step closer, the glow of the carving pulsing in time with hers. "What are you?" "What you asked for," she said simply. "What all who send their lanterns ask for remembrance." The lanterns brightened, filling the chamber with a soft, golden haze. Within each, Orion saw faces laughing, weeping, sleeping. He recognized some, his father as a young man, his mother at the shore, strangers long gone. They were fragments, held within the light as if time itself had been folded and stored away. His voice trembled. "You keep them here. Not kept, remembered. The sea does not take, it keeps. Every promise, every word spoken to the tide remains. But memory is weight, and we are heavy with it." The light dimmed slightly, as though burdened by its own truth. The figure reached out her hand, and in her palm flickered a small flame the same pale hue as Arian's lantern. "Yours was never released. You turned away before it crossed the horizon." He stared at the flame, his breath unsteady. "Then what happens if I let it go now?" The figure's voice softened, almost tender. "Then the tide will remember you no longer. You will be free to forget, to live without the pull of what was lost." The chamber was silent except for the pulse of water and light. Orion felt the weight of years pressing on his chest, the ache of what he'd held onto, the unanswered questions, the nights he'd spent staring into the dark waiting for a voice that never came. And yet, something in him resisted. Forgetting felt like surrender. He closed his fingers around the carving, feeling its pulse. "No," he whispered. "If the sea remembers, then let it remember me." For the first time, the figure's veil stirred as though in approval. "Then you are not lost." The lanterns flared, one by one, until the chamber shone like a sun beneath the ocean. The light grew too bright to bear, and when Orion opened his eyes again, he was lying on the shore, dawn spilling over the horizon. In his hand was a single shard of glass, cool and clear. Beneath the waves, far out where the sea met the sky, a faint golden glow moved steadily toward the deep, and the people of Solmare, waking to another day, found their lanterns washed ashore, not burned out, but burning brighter than ever before. The sea had been restless since that dawn. For 3 days and nights, the waves crashed harder than the wind could explain, and the tide refused to obey the moon. The elders muttered that Solmare had woken something that had been meant to stay sleeping beneath the water's quiet skin. But Orion, standing alone on the shore, did not feel fear. He felt expectation, like a hand hovering just above his shoulder, waiting to turn him toward something inevitable. The shard he had found glimmered faintly in his palm. It looked like nothing, a piece of clear glass no larger than a seashell, yet when the sunlight touched it, faint shapes swam within. Faces, maybe, or echoes of light pretending to be faces. Sometimes he thought he saw his mother's smile flicker in its depths, other times the reflection of lanterns floating upward, not outward, as if the sea itself had reversed. He'd hidden it from everyone. When the tide gave a man a gift, it was not something to show. The fishermen whispered that strange things taken from the sea always came with a promise, one that could never be broken, though few remembered what they had promised to begin with. On the 4th evening, as the sky bled gold into violet, Orion saw the light again. It hovered just beyond the tide's reach, faint but deliberate, pulsing like a heartbeat. And though reason told him to stay away, the pull was stronger. Stronger than sleep, stronger than fear. He followed it down the narrow rocks, his boots sinking into the wet sand as the surf whispered around him. Back again. A voice called behind him. Orion turned. It was Ira, the keeper of the bell tower, the one who tended the lights along Solmare's cliffs. Her eyes were pale as storm glass, her face calm, though her gaze carried the weight of someone who had seen too much night. "You shouldn't walk alone when the sea's unsettled," she said, drawing her cloak tighter. "The sea doesn't frighten me," Orion replied quietly. "It called me." Ira's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Then you've already gone too far," he frowned. "What do you mean?" She stepped closer, her boots sinking into the sand beside his. "Do you know why we send the lanterns, Orion? Not for beauty, not for prayer. It's a trade. We give the sea light so it doesn't take it from us. But sometimes, when someone breaks the pattern, when a lantern is sent and not seen to the end, the tide comes to collect the promise itself." Her gaze flickered to the shard in his hand. "And it looks like it found you." Before he could answer, a sound broke through the air, not thunder, not waves. It was low, like a hum, steady and deep enough to vibrate through his bones. The sea had grown still. The horizon was smooth as glass, but beneath it, movement. Something vast shifting in silence. The light had brightened suddenly, bursting into a flare that lit the sand in pale gold. The waves recoiled from it, forming a perfect ring of stillness around the glow. Then, from within the circle, a shape began to rise. At first, it was only water forming the outline of a figure. Then, as the glow faded, it took form, a woman draped in translucent veils that shimmered like liquid moonlight. Her eyes reflected the whole ocean, endless and knowing. Ira inhaled sharply. The tidekeeper. Orion felt his heartbeat slow, the world narrowing to that impossible figure. "You're real." The tidekeeper's voice was a whisper that rippled the sand. "Real is only what is remembered." Her gaze fixed on him. "You carried the shard. You touched what should not be touched. Do you seek to return, or to claim what it holds?" Orion hesitated, the wind tugging at his sleeve. The shard burned faintly in his palm, warm as breath. "I don't understand what it is." "It is memory," the tidekeeper said, stepping forward. "A fragment of what the sea keeps when it cannot forget. Once, you sent your light to us, but turned away before it reached the deep. So the memory of your promise remained unfinished, unanchored. That fragment is you, and not you. If you return it, you will be whole again. But if you keep it," the air around them darkened slightly, the sound of waves deepening. "You will never belong to land or sea. You will walk between them until the light finds you once more." Ira stepped forward, her hand on Arian's arm. "Don't listen. The tidekeeper speaks in circles. Every answer is another chain." But Arian's mind had already drifted elsewhere. "If I return it," he said slowly, "will she remember me?" The tidekeeper tilted her head. "The one who waits beneath. She remembers all things, but not as you hope. Memory in the sea is not like memory on land. It does not heal. It endures." The horizon glimmered, faint ripples of light spreading outward from the figure's feet. For a heartbeat, Orion thought he saw a shadow in the waves, a faint silhouette, familiar and waiting. His breath caught. Ira's voice hardened. "She's showing you what you want. That's how the sea binds you. You think it offers mercy, but it only trades." The tidekeeper turned her gaze toward Ira, her expression unreadable. "You speak as though you have not traded your own light once." Ira froze. For a moment, her calm mask cracked, and Orion saw fear flicker behind her eyes. The tidekeeper extended her hand toward Orion. "Choose. Return it, and the tide will release its claim. Keep it, and the sea will follow you until you remember what you were meant to forget." The shard's glow pulsed faster, like a heartbeat racing toward its own echo. Orion stared at it, torn between longing and instinct. The waves whispered his name in the language only dreams understand. Then, without quite knowing why, he closed his fist around it. The light flared, searing through his palm, and the world folded. For a breathless instant, he saw everything: lanterns adrift across endless water, faces suspended in the deep, 1,000 voices calling not in sorrow but in yearning. Then came silence. When he opened his eyes, he was standing knee-deep in water. The shore was gone. Ira was gone. Only the vast ocean stretched around him, still and bright beneath 2 moons that hung unnaturally close. The shard in his hand was gone too, but in its place, a faint mark glowed on his wrist, a symbol that pulsed like the tide itself. He turned slowly. The tidekeeper was nowhere in sight, but her voice lingered in the air, distant as thunder over water. "Now you remember the way. The next lantern will not wait. Then the sound of rushing waves swallowed everything. Far away, in Solmare, Ira climbed the bell tower and lit the great lantern that faced the horizon, a light that had not been kindled in generations. As its flame caught the wind, she whispered to the sea below, her voice trembling not from fear, but from memory, "Forgive him. He doesn't know what he's become." But the sea did not answer. It never needed to. When the tide receded at dawn, the sea left something behind. Not driftwood, nor shells, nor the silver ribbons of weed that usually lined Solmare's beaches, but lines in the sand, long and curved, drawn as though by the hand of an invisible cartographer. They formed a pattern too deliberate to be natural. Circles within circles, spirals reaching toward the cliffs, and in their center lay a single lantern, unlit, untouched by salt. The people gathered around it in uneasy silence. No one dared move it. They whispered that the tide had brought back a promise, that the sea was reminding them it remembered. Only Ira knew whose lantern it was. She had climbed down from the tower at dawn, her hands trembling as she touched the cold metal rim. It was Arian's. She recognized the pattern of etchings along its base, a fisherman's knot carved there years ago in the way only his hands could have made. But there was something else now. An unfamiliar symbol burned into the surface, a spiral like the ones in the sand. It pulsed faintly, as though alive. Ira stepped back. The air was too still. The gulls would not land. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The elders came with their relics, muttering prayers to the sea, but their words scattered before they reached the water. "It's begun again," one whispered. "The old pattern. The sea calls back its lanterns." No one asked what that meant. In Solmare, some knowledge was better left beneath the waves. That evening, the horizon glowed in an unfamiliar way. Not gold, not rose, but something between, like dawn trapped beneath dusk. The fishermen refused to sail. The nets lay coiled and silent. And though the town prepared for night, the bells did not ring. Ira stood on the cliffs as darkness fell, the lantern in her hands. Its metal felt warm, as if the sea's pulse still throbbed inside it. The spiraled mark along its rim glimmered faintly under moonlight, calling to something in her she had long buried. She remembered the tidekeeper's words, "You traded your light once." It had been years ago, in the days when she was young and desperate enough to believe the ocean could give what life withheld. She had set her lantern afloat, not to ask for love or forgiveness, but for memory itself, to remember the face of her brother who had vanished into the sea when she was a child. And the sea had answered, though not as she expected. It gave her a memory that was not her own, flashes of a world beneath the waves, and the voices of those who had never returned. Since that night, she had felt the pull of the tide in her veins like a second heartbeat. Now it was stronger than ever. "Orion," she whispered, her voice trembling against the wind. "What did you do?" The lantern flared. "Just once." And the sea answered. The waters below the cliffs churned as if the horizon itself had drawn breath. A column of light rose from the deep, white and gold and blinding, splitting the dark in two. The sound was not thunder, but something older, a deep vibration that resonated in the bones. Ira dropped to her knees, the lantern still clutched to her chest, as figures began to emerge within the light. They weren't entirely solid, shimmering outlines shaped from water and light. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, their movements fluid, graceful, mournful. Each held a lantern of their own, their faces turned toward the shore. And among them, walking as if through a dream, was Orion. He looked unchanged, yet not the same. His eyes carried the reflection of the sea's endless light, and faint patterns shimmered along his skin like veins of silver. He moved as though half tethered to the world, half drifting away from it. When he saw Ira, a small, uncertain smile touched his lips. "Ira," he said, his voice carrying across the water though he barely spoke. "You found it." She rose, heart hammering. "What happened to you?" "The sea remembered," he replied simply, "and it showed me what it cannot forget." Ira took a step closer to the edge. "You shouldn't have followed it. The tidekeeper, she tricked you." Orion shook his head slowly. "No, she only gave me what I asked for. I just didn't understand what that was." He looked down at his hands, the faint mark glowing on his wrist. "I thought I wanted answers. But the sea doesn't give answers, it gives mirrors. It showed me what Solmare was built upon. The sea built it," she said, half in defiance, half in fear. "The sea," Orion said quietly, "only filled what we left hollow." Before Ira could reply, the water around him rippled, and the tidekeeper rose once more from the light. Her form shimmered between substance and shadow, her voice calm as the surface before a storm. "The boundary weakens," she said. "When one carries both light and memory, the tide no longer knows where to stop." I returned to her. "Then stop this." Take back what's yours. The tidekeeper's gaze lingered on Orion. He is mine only if he forgets the shore. Orion stepped forward, the glow from the sea catching his face in gold. And if I remember, then the sea will remember you too, she said. And Solmare will no longer be safe. The waves surged against the cliffs, each one higher than the last. The sky dimmed, stars blinking out as though swallowed. The air itself seemed to lean toward the water, drawn by its pull. Ira's voice was barely more than a whisper. What happens if you stay? Orion looked up, meeting her eyes. Then the tide rises. It takes what belongs to it, and the world becomes smaller for it. She stepped forward, desperate. Then leave. Leave but before she could finish, the lantern in her hands flared, and light exploded across the shore. The figures of the drowned lantern-bearers flickered once and vanished. The tidekeeper's form wavered, her voice echoing through the wind. It begins again. The lanterns awakened. Then the light collapsed inward. When Ira opened her eyes, she was alone. The sea was calm once more, as if nothing had happened. Only the spiraled marks in the sand remained, glowing faintly before the tide swept them away. She turned the lantern over in her hands, searching for the symbol, but it was gone. In its place was only a single word, etched so finely she almost missed it. Remember. Far beneath the surface, in the silence where no wind could reach, 1,000 lanterns burned brighter than before. And at their center, a single figure walked among them, neither of land nor sea, carrying the memory of both. Arian's voice whispered through the depths, soft and steady, carried by the current like a prayer. If the sea remembers, then so must we. And the ocean, vast and listening, replied in kind. The next morning, Solmare woke to silence. The wind had gone, the gulls had vanished. Even the waves broke against the rocks without their usual voice, as if the sea itself had forgotten how to breathe. It was not peace, it was pause. The kind that comes before the world remembers something it tried to forget. Ira had not slept. She sat in the bell tower with the cold lantern beside her, watching the still horizon. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw Arian's face in the light, half human, half reflection. The words he had spoken lingered like salt on her tongue. The sea built nothing. It only filled what we left hollow. By noon, the stillness broke. A tremor rolled through the cliffs, deep and steady. The fishermen ran from the docks shouting that the tide had begun to rise, though the moons were still split and far apart. The water had grown brighter, too pale as glass, with shapes moving beneath the surface that did not obey its sway. When Ira looked closer, she realized the shapes were lanterns, hundreds of them floating upward through the water, rising from the deep like stars returning to the sky. And with every lantern that surfaced, the sea glowed more fiercely, until the whole horizon shimmered like molten gold. The town gathered at the shore, awestruck. No one spoke. The air itself seemed enchanted. But Ira knew better. This was no miracle. It was the tide remembering. At last, one of the lanterns drifted to her feet. It was small, carved of dark wood, its flame dancing without smoke. Inside, she saw not fire but a memory, her own. A younger version of herself, barefoot on the beach, whispering her wish to the waves before sending her first lantern adrift. The reflection looked up at her, smiled, and vanished as the flame dimmed. The lantern shattered like glass in her hands. From the sea, a voice rose, soft at first, then deep enough to shake the shore. The light returns to its bearer. The tide cannot hold what is willing to be remembered. I returned toward the sound. The tidekeeper stood upon the water, her form solid now, not shifting. For the first time, her eyes held something almost human, sorrow. The boundary breaks, she said quietly. He has chosen to remember. Ira's breath caught. Orion. The tidekeeper nodded once. He has carried the light too long. The sea does not forgive what it must keep. The horizon flickered. The light in the water trembled. Shapes began to rise again, not lanterns this time, but figures. Not living, yet not gone either. Their outlines glimmered with faint silver fire, each one holding a lantern whose flame burned inward instead of out. The forgotten, whispered one of the elders. They're coming home. But they were not walking toward the shore. They were walking through it. The air around them warped, bending light and shadow alike. Wherever they stepped, sand turned to glass. Their faces were calm as if caught halfway between memory and dream. And then she saw him. Orion walked at their front, his eyes no longer glowing but dark and endless, reflecting everything. The mark on his wrist blazed like a compass of light. When he saw her, he stopped. The others halted behind him as if bound to his breath. Ira, he said softly. She stepped forward, ignoring the trembling ground beneath her. You shouldn't have come back. I never left, he said. Solmare is part of the sea now. It always was. We just forgot. The town will drown if you stay, she said. He smiled faintly, a sad, knowing smile. No, it will remember. The sea doesn't take, it returns. The tidekeeper raised her hand, her voice like wine through deep caverns. If you bring the memory to land, it will consume both. Light cannot live in stillness. Orion looked at her. Then maybe the stillness should end. A low hum rose from the waves, growing louder until the ground beneath Solmare began to crack. The water at the horizon surged upward not as a wave, but as a wall of light, brilliant and terrible. Within it, thousands of lanterns burned like trapped suns. The villagers cried out, some falling to their knees, others running for the cliffs. Ira stood firm. She could feel the sea's pull, deep in her blood. The same call she had heard as a child. It was no longer distant, it was inside her heartbeat. Aron raised his hand, the mark on his wrist blazing white. The lanterns in the wall pulsed in answer. The tidekeeper's expression darkened. If you do this, you will unbind the memory of all things. You will set them free, but they will have nowhere to return. That's the point, he said quietly. The sea shouldn't hold what it mourns. And with that, he broke the mark across his wrist with a single motion. The light exploded outward, silent, blinding, infinite. The lanterns shattered across the horizon, releasing their flames into the sky. The ocean's glow vanished in an instant, leaving behind only the sound of wind and waves returning to their natural rhythm. When the light faded, Orion was gone. The sea was calm again. The air moved. The gulls returned. Solmare breathed. But where he had stood, the sand was no longer sand, it was glass, smooth and clear, and beneath it, faint lights flickered. Drifting slowly toward the deep, Ira fell to her knees. Her reflection fractured across the glassy surface. In it, she saw her own lantern rising from the depths, unbroken now, burning steady and true. A whisper brushed her ear, soft as foam. If the sea remembers, then so must we. She closed her eyes and let the tide wash over her hands. When she looked again, the lantern was gone. That night, the people of Solmare found their shores lined with new lanterns, each bearing no flame, only reflection. And when they looked into them, they saw not the sea, but moments they thought lost, a child's laughter, a long-forgotten face, a promise whispered and never kept. The town fell silent again, not in fear, but in awe. From that night forward, Solmare no longer sent its lanterns away. They lit them and set them upon the water, but they stayed to watch until dawn, until the tide took each light beyond sight, and somewhere far beneath, among the countless drifting memories, a single lantern burned brighter than the rest, its flame steady, its glow unending. Arians. Years passed before the people of Solmare began to speak of that night again. At first, they whispered only in the dark, half in awe, half in fear of the day the tide turned to light, of the man who vanished into its heart. But as seasons shifted and memories softened, the tale became ritual, and ritual turned once more into myth. Children born after that night grew up beneath calmer skies. The sea returned to its rhythm, though sometimes, on windless evenings, the water would shimmer faintly, as if lanterns still moved beneath the surface. The elders said it was only reflection, but those who had seen the truth never quite believed it. Ira remained in Solmare. She grew older, but her hair never lost its color, and her eyes, storm bright, steady, held the same quiet grief. Each year, on the night of the twin moons, she climbed the cliffs with her lantern. She no longer sent it away. She simply lit it and waited. And every year, just before dawn, the flame would flicker 3 times in the wind and steady again. That was how she knew he still walked beneath the waves. One autumn evening, a stranger came to Solmare. He was young, with sea-gray eyes and the calm of someone who had already listened to too many silences. The villagers welcomed him with polite caution. He said he was a scholar of the old traditions, come to record the forgotten histories of coastal towns. But when he reached the cliffs and saw the lanterns, something in his expression shifted. Ira met him at the bell tower. "You've chosen a poor time for study," she said with a hint of dry humor. "The sea keeps its own secrets." He smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but I've heard that Solmare remembers better than most." Ira tilted her head. "And who told you that?" The young man hesitated. "A dream," he said softly. A voice that said the tide remembers what the land forgets. Ira's hand stilled on the railing. "Dreams can be dangerous here." "I know," he said. But it didn't feel like a dream. It felt like being called. The sea below them shifted, then calm, but listening. The air grew heavier, familiar in its silence. Ira looked at him carefully. "What is your name?" He hesitated. as though searching for something long buried. "Eric," he said at last. I think, the way he spoke, the name, the pause, the uncertainty made something cold stir in her chest. She had heard that tone before, long ago, in the voice of a man who had looked at the sea as though it were both wound and home. That night, when the twin moons crossed paths again, the townspeople gathered for the lantern procession. Though the old ways had softened, the ritual remained, each person lighting a flame, setting it upon the tide. But as the lanterns drifted, one began to move differently, slowly at first, then against the current, glowing brighter than the rest. The people murmured, uneasy. The same story again, the same light returning. Ira's heart pounded as the lantern came to rest against the rocks below her tower. The stranger Eric was already moving toward it. "Don't," she called. "Let it go." He turned, eyes wide in the pale light. "It's mine." Before she could reach him, he stepped into the surf and lifted the lantern. The instant his hand touched it, the water stilled. The flame inside flared white, searing, and a single droplet of light rose from its center, hovering between sea and sky. Ira's breath caught. No, not again. The light pulsed once, twice, then burst outward into a spiral that stretched across the horizon, the same pattern she had seen years ago carved in the sand. The tide began to glow from within, and the air filled with the faint chime of unseen bells. Eric stumbled back, clutching his wrist. A mark had appeared there identical to the one that had burned on Arian's hand. The spiral of Solmare. He looked up, terrified. "What's happening to me?" Ira's voice was barely a whisper. "The sea remembers." The waves parted then, smooth as glass, and from the depths the tidekeeper rose, once more taller than before, her eyes endless, her form no longer shifting but solid, radiant, sorrowful. "The light has returned to the shore," she said. "The memory completes its circle." Ira bowed her head. "He's not the one you seek. All who carry the light are the same," said the tidekeeper. "Memory does not die, it changes shape." She extended a hand toward Eric, who trembled, torn between awe and fear. The mark on his wrist flared in response, casting golden reflections across his face. For an instant, Ira saw another face within his, the faint echo of Orion, the same quiet eyes, the same defiant calm. "Why me?" Eric whispered. The tidekeeper's gaze softened. "Because you were his promise." The sea rippled around them, glowing brighter, until the stars vanished behind the light. Ira stepped forward. "If you take him, it will begin again. The cycle will never end. The sea will keep taking, the land will keep forgetting." The tidekeeper turned her eyes to her. "Then break the circle." Ira's breath trembled. "How?" "By giving back what was taken freely." Ira closed her eyes. She understood. The lantern still in her hand, the one she had lit each year, had never belonged to her alone. It was the memory she had kept, the one the sea had been waiting for. She knelt at the water's edge and placed the lantern on the surface. "Then take it," she whispered, "and let him rest." The flame within the lantern pulsed once, then twice, and finally, it sank beneath the water without a sound. The glow spread outward, and the waves shimmered like silk. Eric gasped as the mark on his wrist faded. The light around him dimmed, leaving only the reflection of moonlight on calm water. The tidekeeper stepped back into the sea, her form dissolving into silver mist. "It is done," she said. "The sea remembers, but it no longer calls." When the water settled, the lanterns drifted peacefully again, moving only where the tide wished. The villagers watched in reverent silence as dawn rose over the calmest sea Solmare had ever known. Ira stood beside Eric, both quiet. He looked at her. "Who was he?" She smiled faintly, tears glimmering like salt. "Someone who taught the sea how to remember, and taught me how to let go." Far out on the horizon, as the first light of day touched the water, a faint golden shimmer lingered for just a breath. It wasn't a lantern this time, only a reflection. But Ira knew. The sea had finally kept its promise, and Solmare, for the first time in living memory, slept in peace.